It comes the sun.
Hello, esteemed colleagues, and welcome to today's webinar, Compensatory Services, a New Conversation. My name is Emily Smith, and I am the founder and CEO of TeleTeachers. If you haven't heard of us previous to this meetup, let me quickly introduce you to exactly who we are. We are an education technology startup, a team of passionate, experienced educators and technology enthusiasts with a mission of ensuring equity in education access for all students receiving special education. We partner with school districts to deliver remote special education instruction and related services so that school leaders have everything they need to meet the needs of our exceptional learners. Our team is not new to the world of online learning, having worked with some of the largest districts in the country long before the pandemic. We are innovative. We are fueled by bringing value to school stakeholders and being thought partners with incredible school leaders. We promise to bring all of our expertise to the table to co-create long-term sustainable programs that ensure every student requiring special education has what they need to succeed. We are delighted you are joining us and also promise not to waste your valuable time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Erin Raffel. Erin Raffel is a key member of our school partnerships team here at TeleTeachers and the leader of our communication and content strategy. With a background in journalism, Erin tirelessly has her ear to the ground uncovering what school leaders are needing to know to do their unbelievably significant jobs more effectively. Thank you, Erin, for your commitment to amplifying the conversation around important issues as you have done today in bringing us together for this new conversation on compensatory education. Erin will be moderating our Q&A after a presentation from the star of today's show, the Honorable Dr. Robert Pasternack. Dr. Robert Pasternack is the CEO of Enseñar Educational Services, Dr. Pasternack has served as the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, OSERS, at the U.S. Department of Education from 2001 to 2004. During his tenure, he was responsible for the reauthorization of IDEA and the implementation of No Child Left Behind. Dr. Pasternack is a nationally certified school psychologist, a certified educational diagnostician, a certified school administrator, and a certified K-12 teacher. That's a lot. And I am honored that you are also a dear friend and dear colleague. And thank you for joining us today. All you.
Thanks. Thanks, Emily. Full disclosure, Emily is a dear friend, and I am honored by the invitation to join you all this afternoon. Thank you all for taking time from your very busy schedules to join me from a very snowy Virginia Beach. It was great that you played Here Comes the Sun, because here came the sun. So thank you. And hopefully we'll melt some of the snow, because we moved to the beach to get away from the snow. So hopefully it all goes somewhere else. So thank you. And I would just at the outset say that if any of you are seriously exploring the bringing teletherapy to your school districts, that you could not find a more reliable, dependable, ethical, honest, hardworking partner than Emily and TeleTeachers. So having said that, I'm going to talk fast, because we're going to go through some of the issues around compensatory services. This is a time where the pandemic and the prolonged absence of our kids from school has created more of a demand for compensatory services than we have ever seen in the past. And I know that you're going to be under tremendous pressure to determine how much, if any, compensatory services are going to be required by the students with disabilities in your school districts. We know that there are 7 million students with disabilities across the country currently receiving special education. When Emily and I were working with a very large school district in Florida before the pandemic, they told us at one of the many meetings we had with them that they were needing to provide $250,000 worth of compensatory services. And this was before the pandemic. So the issue of compensatory services is not new, but the conversation that we're going to have today is new because of the environment in which we find ourselves. So I appreciate that Erin is going to monitor the chat, and hopefully there'll be time at the end for some questions, or throughout the conversation. I wish that we were having a conversation with each other instead of my talking to you all. But given the Zoom environment that we all spend too much time in these days, I think you'll understand that we'll look for your questions and comments via the chat box. So having said that, the fundamental beliefs, and I think Emily alluded to some of the beliefs that underlie her founding this latest venture of hers, but schools can and must provide education to all kids, including kids with disabilities, the equity issue that Emily mentioned, health and safety of students and our educators, our staff, the whole learning community, and service providers must be a first consideration for all of us, and the needs and best interests of the individual student. Not any system should guide decisions and expenditures, because yes, we're talking about compensatory services, which will have a profound impact on your budget. And yes, President Biden has talked about fully funding IDEA, but those of you who've been around a long time like I have know, don't hold your breath. Congress has been talking about that only since 1975. And when the goal was to provide 40% of the excess costs incurred in providing specially designed instruction and related services to what we used to call handicapped kids, what we now call kids with disabilities. And when President Ford was prepared to veto the original Public Law 94-142, it was because he realized at the time that the public schools would never see the realization of that promise. And certainly he was prescient. And here we are 40 some odd years later. And in fact, the federal share is about 15%, nowhere near the 40% that was promised. So parents or the recipients of services, the kids that you all serve and work so hard to serve, must be informed of and involved in decisions relating to the provision of the services that the students are entitled to under IDEA. You all know that the IEP is the guiding document to help make that determination. And services that were typically provided in person now need to be provided through alternative methods, which require you all to engage in creative and innovative approaches that we know are going on all over the country: synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid, in-person, virtual models. All of these things that we were talking about before the pandemic have now become part of our everyday conversations. So we know that, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the definition, that's an equitable remedy designed to repair educational and functional deficits resulting from the denial of FAPE. And that is going to be a key concept as you all go back to your districts after the gift of your time this afternoon, and take a look at have kids been denied FAPE as a result of their prolonged absence from school? We're going to get into that more, but there's going to be, sadly, perhaps a growing amount of litigation, which is going to be designed to really get at this definition of has FAPE been denied given the prolonged absence of kids from school caused by the pandemic. In determining compensatory services, you at the LEA, and I use LEA as local educational agency, but we're talking about the district level. Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they call them divisions, but nonetheless the school district, and state education agencies have to employ a qualitative approach intended to place a student in the same position they would have been in if FAPE had been provided, rather than calculating the award to account to the rather than calculating the award to account for the exact amount of service minutes identified on the IEP. So this is something to help guide you in your determining how much, if any, compensatory services the students with disabilities in your school districts are going to be eligible to receive. In addition to the traditional use of the term compensatory education services to describe services required to remedy a violation of IDEA that resulted in a denial of FAPE, the term is also used by the Department of Ed to describe services that may be required to remedy the loss of skills regression as a result of extended school closures and disruptions to in-person instruction, circumstances caused by the pandemic that are beyond the control of the schools. So this is how the U.S. Department of Education, and yeah, there was a lot of criticism, and I think, quite frankly, much of it very well deserved, about how little guidance was really provided by the former administration, by the Department of Education, as the pandemic made its way across the country and caused such a disruption to not only schools, but to the economy in general. But what services are going to be required to remedy the loss of skill? We know that there's going to be a significant amount of regression. And one of the fears that your colleagues across the country have expressed to me in my work with folks across the country is, we know that the summer learning loss, the summer slide, something that's been very well documented for a very long time. So we know that when kids are out of school, even for that short amount of time, we see regression in their skills. That's why you all have been providing extended school year services to those students with disabilities who are eligible to receive those services, to facilitate the recoupment of the skills that they lose when they are out of school. Now, we're seeing all kids that are going to have regression caused by their prolonged absence from school. And one of the things we've been talking to folks about is the fear that special ed is going to be inundated with inappropriate referrals because teachers are going to say, my goodness, these kids have regressed and therefore they need special education. And I've been encouraging general ed folks across the country to make sure that they're doing universal screening when kids return to school to determine how much regression has occurred, and also to make sure that special ed becomes the last thing they think about when kids are struggling, not the first thing they think about when kids are struggling. So many of you certainly know about 504 and ADA, and sometimes in special ed departments, the 504 people responsible for 504 compliance are housed within special ed departments, but ADA much less so in terms of its impact on schools. But nonetheless, 504, which as you all know, predated Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which predates clearly IDEA. And Title II of ADA do not specifically address a situation in which elementary and secondary schools are closed for an extended period of time because of exceptional circumstances. If your district closes its schools to slow or stop the spread of COVID and does not provide any educational services to the general student population, then your district would not be required to provide services to students with disabilities during that same period of time. Let me go ahead. Emily, in her kind introduction, I want to make sure you all know I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. We have too many lawyers involved in special education, in my not so humble opinion as it is. But nonetheless, I want to make sure that you understand that when your schools are closed to stop the spread of COVID-19, and if they close again when kids are we know the goal of the Biden administration is to get particularly kids K through 8 back into school. But if you don't provide any educational services to the general student population, then you're not going to be required to provide services to students with disabilities during that same period of time. And I'll make these slides available to Erin and Alyssa and Emily, and so that please feel free to then look at these slides, and then if you have questions or comments, you can send them to the lovely folks and hardworking folks at TeleTeachers, and they'll send them to me, and then we'll make sure that we get back to you with answers to your questions if we can.
Dr. Pasternack, would you like to throw your slides up now? You can share them with everyone if you want to share.
Okay, with my limited technological skills, you want to tell me how I'm going to go ahead and do that?
You should be able to just share your screen, and if you have yours up.
So I am sharing the screen, right?
No.
I'm not sharing the screen? So what happened, Alyssa, with what we were doing before?
Apologies. Technical difficulties. You did. There you go. Perfect.
Goodness gracious. My apologies to everyone. Oh, I wish, thanks for letting me know. Good.
Yeah,
Lord.
no problem. There we go.
Just looking at me. Goodness gracious. Okay. So, wow, the world of technology. So, folks, I apologize for that. I had thought that when we were getting ready for today's presentation, I thought the slides were already on. So, my apologies for my assumption that they were already there, and we all know how dangerous it is to assume things. So, here are the slides, and yes, I will make sure to get them to the folks at TeleTeachers so that they can make them available to all of you, should you want them. If your district continues to provide education to the general student population during school closure, then the school must ensure that students with disabilities also have equal access to the same opportunities, including the provision of FAPE. And there are just some of the legal citations from IDEA, 504, and ADA that require that to happen. Once school resumes, and we all know that we hope that kids are going to get back to school very soon, because virtual learning does not have such a great history prior to the pandemic of being an effective way of delivering services to all kids, let alone kids with disabilities. But once school resumes, district must make every effort to provide special ed and related services to the child in accordance with the IEP for students entitled to FAPE or under 504, consistent with a plan developed to meet the requirements of 504. So this was just a little bit more because we know that across the country, there's been a significant increase in the number of 504 requests made. I'm not going to get into all of that this afternoon, but many of you may have been experiencing that in your districts. An IEP team, and as appropriate, the kid with a disability, personnel responsible for ensuring FAPE to a student for the purpose of 504 would be required to make an individualized determination as to whether compensatory services are needed under applicable standards and requirements. The state, your state education agency, your district, and the schools must ensure that to the greatest extent possible, each student with a disability can be provided the special ed and related services identified in the student's IEP developed under IDEA or the plan that you all have developed under 504. So this is something that I know you are all well aware of, that we want to make sure that the services that are identified in the IEP are in fact being provided. This has been one of the greatest sources of litigation before the pandemic, where parents have been concerned that the services that are identified in the IEP are not in fact being delivered. And we know that that fear and that the finding is only going to be exacerbated by the pandemic and the students' prolonged absences from school. If a child with a disability is absent for an extended period of time because of a COVID-19 infection and the school remains open. So this is now looking at a case where the kid has COVID, but the school remains open. Then the IEP team must determine whether the child is available for instruction and could benefit from homebound services, such as online, virtual instruction, instructional telephone calls, and other curriculum-based instructional activities to the extent that those are available in your district. Emily, I know one of the many projects that she was involved in was a pilot in New York City, our country's largest school district, where we were looking at providing teletherapy services to students who were homebound, those with very significant disabilities, and this was before the pandemic. So, and that was an incredibly successful program based on the feedback from the folks there in New York City. But you all know about homebound as something that has been available prior to the pandemic, and here's just some guidance for your IEP teams about that in the COVID environment. If a child does not receive services during a school closure, the IEP team, or again on the 504 team, must make an individualized determination whether and to what extent compensatory services may be needed, consistent with applicable requirements, including to make up for any skills that may have been lost. So again, this is the issue about let's determine how much regression we can document, and then what is going to be the plan to help the student recoup the skills that the student has lost as a result of the closure and the kid not getting services. If the placement team determines that the child meets established high-risk criteria, and due to safety and health concerns, the kid's needs could not be met through homebound instruction, then under that section of IDEA, your agency, your school district must issue prior written notice proposing a change in placement. So here we go, talking about some of the incredible, complicated requirements that you all know are part of the civil rights legislation, which began in 1975. So this was just kind of a reminder to all of you as to when prior written notice has to be provided to families. So creating a contingency plan before a COVID-19 outbreak occurs, which I know many of you have been too involved in during the last few months, gives the kids' service providers and the child's parents an opportunity to reach agreement as to what circumstances would trigger the use of the child's distance learning plan and the services that would be provided during dismissal. One of the many folks that Emily and her team work with across the country was talking about that they are working harder under COVID than they were even before the pandemic because of having to do distance learning plans for every student with a disability in the district. So this is something that I know many of you may already be aware of. This is a tiny bit about the funding issue, and this is allowing the use of your IDEA Part B funds may be used for activities that directly relate to providing and ensuring the continuity of special ed and related services to students with disabilities. However, you can't use your IDEA Part B funds to develop or distribute general COVID-19 guidance or to carry out activities that are not specific to students with disabilities, like COVID-19 activities for all kids and staff. So this sort of was my attempt to keep you out of IDEA jail and keep you out of trouble with your state education agencies when they monitor how you are spending your IDEA Part B funding. Additionally, LEAs or districts may not use Part B funds to administer future COVID-19 vaccinations to any kids, including kids with disabilities. So again, this was just sort of a what you can and cannot use your IDEA Part B funds for during the pandemic. During the unprecedented national emergency that we find ourselves in, schools must prioritize safety. I mentioned that at the outset, and consistent with that priority, you have to ensure that to the greatest extent practicable, students with disabilities are provided special ed related services identified on their IEPs, because FAPE must now be provided consistent with the need to protect health and safety. There may be disruptions, delays, and or changes in how services are provided that result in the student losing skills, the regression that I have already spoken a little bit about this afternoon. Schools therefore have to make an individualized determination whether and to what extent compensatory education services may be needed to make up for any skills that may have been lost as a result of the disruption to FAPE caused by COVID-19. You have to ensure that individualized determinations are made as to whether and to what extent a student may require compensatory ed services to remediate a loss or regression in skills as a result of the inability to provide services during COVID-related disruptions, like the suspension of in-person instruction. So again, this really points to that one of the many challenges you're going to have about the assessment that's got to be done to determine how much regression has taken place. And hopefully you have good data systems in your schools which allow you to know where the kid was before the pandemic disruption in services, and then can measure how much regression has occurred so that you are on solid footing in making the determination about the quantity of regression that has occurred. Following factors are going to be relevant when you're determining whether a student requires compensatory education services. So the rate of progress on the IEP prior to the closure and disruption. So that gets to the point that I was just making in terms of how are you documenting progress, what kinds of progress monitoring were you conducting with the interventions that were being provided in the specially designed instruction that was being provided to students. And we all remember the unanimous Supreme Court ruling in the Andrew case, mandating that we really do a better job of making sure that students with disabilities get the educational benefit to which they are entitled under IDEA and improve outcomes and results, which is clearly a major challenge that we all are presented with. And this was before the pandemic. But you want to look at how you were measuring the rate of progress on the goals contained in the IEP prior to the closure and disruption. And you want to calculate the difference between IEP progress monitoring data preceding the closure or disruption and the IEP progress monitoring data collected at a reasonable time after the return to in-person instruction. So that is how you're going to be able to document the amount of regression that has occurred based on comparing those two data points. You want to look at the difference between services identified on the IEP and services offered during the closure disruption, including the amount, frequency, duration, type, and the delivery model, and the accessibility of services offered to the student when your schools have been closed. So whether you, again, synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid, totally virtual, what model of services have you been using in your district during this unprecedented time that we have found ourselves in? Changes in the general ed curriculum, as well as the level and type of instruction for all students during the closure and disruption. So we know that one of the changes that were made to IDEA in 1997, before I had the responsibility of the 2004 reauthorization, was that students with disabilities must have access to, must participate in, and must make progress in the general education curriculum. So you want to make sure that what changes have there been for all of your kids during the closure and disruption caused by the pandemic, and get input and information from parents concerning student performance during the closure and disruption. We all know about the stress that families have been under, which has been so large and so much stress caused by the pandemic and homeschooling. And we were worrying about the kids with disabilities getting specially designed instruction from the professionals prior to the pandemic, and to expect that parents are going to be able to accomplish what we weren't able to accomplish when the kids were in school is totally unreasonable and unrealistic. And we all know that we need to partner with parents rather than having adversarial relationships with them. Compensatory ed services and ESY services are not interchangeable, and a particular student with a disability may be entitled to one, both, or neither, depending on the child's individual circumstances. So I wanted to make sure that you all just were reminded of the difference between ESY and compensatory ed, and I had mentioned that earlier, but I wanted to reiterate that. Schools should not create blanket rules offering ESY to all students with disabilities, or offering a set amount of compensatory education services to all students when they return to school. Again, we all know that the I in the IDEA and the I in the IEP are all about making individualized decisions, individualized determinations. So you cannot make decisions that you're going to do something for all of your students when we know that we have a heterogeneous group of students with disabilities, and there are significant differences in the needs that those kids present. During a closure, so although compensatory services may be most appropriately determined when your schools return to normal operations, the need for such services be considered as a situation evolves and schools begin to phase in more services, as many of you have already been doing. In addition, schools should consider services that can be provided during the COVID-related disruptions that may mitigate the need for or the amount of compensatory educational services that students may be entitled to receive when schools reopen. Schools have to make an individualized determination, which includes input and involvement from parents as to whether a student needs compensatory education services as a result of disruptions to in-person instruction. And I wanted to just, again, emphasize the critical importance of parent involvement. Our belief is that parents are the true experts on their kids. They know more about their kids than anybody else. We have to be resources and allies and partners and consultants to parents and families and caregivers. And again, I know that you all understand the critical importance of not having adversarial relationships with parents because of what that can cause and cost when parents are unhappy. Compensatory services should be determined by collecting and examining student-specific data, and that includes information from parents to determine if the student lost skills or regressed on IEP goals as a result of COVID-related disruptions in instructional and related services, or your inability to provide FAPE. This is just sort of as we wrap up the presentation and leave a little time for Erin's questions. To remind you about something I had mentioned earlier. Parental input will also be useful for evaluating student performance during the suspension of in-person instruction and the need, amount, and delivery of compensatory education services. So again, rather than not working with families, this is sort of the imploring you all to make sure, something I know you are well aware of, but to make sure that we are working with parents rather than doing things to parents and caregivers. So in making individualized determinations about compensatory ed, schools should consider a variety of information. So you should try to include this, but not be limited to the services provided to all kids during the suspension of in-person instruction, the ability of the student to access their services provided, the amount of regression and progress or lack of progress which is made on IEP goals. Your schools should offer compensatory services sufficient to allow the student to recoup the lost skills and continue to make progress on the goals articulated in the IEP. And parents and schools are encouraged to consider creative and innovative ways to address regression or skills that are lost during the pandemic that carefully consider the kids' individual circumstances, including the student's strengths, the impact of the disability on learning, and the student's stamina. This is one of the many issues that we've heard about across the country in terms of kids having great difficulty being able to benefit from virtual learning, sitting at a computer for prolonged periods of time, particularly very young kids who are not used to doing that sort of thing. And the pandemic has only exacerbated those problems. Compensatory services may be provided during the regular school day, over school breaks, in intensive, targeted, individualized programs, one-on-one instruction. There's been a lot of discussion recently about tutoring, and by outside service providers. So here's your opportunity to engage TeleTeachers to help you when you have decided how much compensatory services are going to be needed by the students with disabilities receiving special ed related services in your school district. And then you are able to use outside service providers to help provide that compensatory amount of services, either during the school day, over breaks, and developing intensive targeted individual programs. If compensatory ed services are provided during the school day, the provision of these services may not be provided in a manner that changes LRE or reduces service minutes on a student's current IEP unless agreed to by the IEP team, including the parent. The issue, of course, about supplementing rather than supplanting, which I know all of you are very familiar with when you deal with funding issues and the use of federal funds. So again, if you're going to provide these services during the school day, you cannot provide them in a manner that changes LRE or reduces the amount of time that you have already put in the student's IEP unless you can get agreement by the IEP team, and that of course includes the parent. I'm about to wrap this up here. I mentioned earlier about prior written notice. I wanted to just sort of, as we end the formal part of the presentation, remind you again that whether a parent agrees or disagrees, your district should issue prior written notice to inform parents about determinations regarding compensatory education services. In addition to the other required content, the prior written notice should explain why the school district is making or refusing to make the offer. This is the offer of compensatory services, and describe the information that served as the basis for this determination in sufficient detail. So this was, again, my attempt to just sort of help keep you out of IDEA jail and reduce the amount of conflict that you'll have with the families in your school districts, and hopefully the amount of complaints and litigation that may arise as a result of kids being out of school during the pandemic. And the last slide that I have is that school districts should regularly make and document attempts to provide services, including contact and communication with parents and students. This is something I know you all are well aware of and have to provide when the lovely folks from your state departments of ed come and monitor your compliance with IDEA. A parent's refusal of services may excuse your district from your obligation to consider or provide compensatory services depending on the individualized circumstances. So that, again, is something to be very cognizant of and look at in terms of whether you get parents to refuse the provision of services to their student. The inability to access services offered would not be considered a refusal. So that is important proviso there. So you can't say that the parent has refused if they're unable to access the services that you're trying to provide. We all know that there's been some bandwidth issues, some accessibility in terms of internet accessibility, having the computer at home, those sorts of things. That the inability of the family to access the services that you're offering are not considered a refusal. And similarly, the student's inability to benefit from the services offered are also not considered a refusal. So with that, I know there's a few minutes left, and I want to thank you all for, again, thank the lovely people at TeleTeachers for the invitation and the opportunity to chat with you this afternoon. And I hope that you have found this helpful. I apologize for the technical glitch at the beginning, and we'll get you these slides when at the end. I'll make sure that TeleTeachers has them in case any of you would want them, and then you can contact them with your questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. So with that, there you go.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Pasternack. We're clearly at a very unique point in history. COVID has been an equity disaster for education and specifically special education. So all of this is really good information. I'm going to try and pepper in some of questions from our audience because I thought that would be, it's good to get those questions answered. So I'll read a couple of quick ones. Are you considering a shift to distance learning as a school closure?
So if the school is closed and the only way that services are being provided, again, some of these are legal questions, and I want to re-emphasize that I am not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. However, if the school is closed and the only way that services are being provided is via distance ed, then I think the answer to that question is yes.
And I have a comment here that says they're in and out of school based on community exposure. They did not change the IEPs back and forth from home service to school service. They left it as they're able to access the general ed and sped services for the times per the IEP. They made sure they had internet services and provided times they could participate in regular ed classes. So the question is, did they have to change all of those IEPs to indicate they were at home as opposed to providing in-building services?
Well, it sounds like this is already something that has occurred. So if the IEPs were not changed when all of those things occurred, it would not be a good idea post hoc after the fact to go back and change those IEPs. So I think that if you already you're going to live with the decision that has been made not to change the IEPs, and not to worry, sleep well. Sounds like you have tried to do the right thing and provide the services that the kids are entitled to receive. I think that there have been a lot of districts that have really tried to develop distance learning plans and have those available to insert when schools open, when schools close, because we know that many places have tried to open schools and then had COVID outbreaks and had to close the schools again. So I think that it's good practice to probably have the distance learning plans developed. But I think that we're coming to a time when schools are, as you all know, the federal intent, and with the new secretary coming on, the intent is to open up schools within the next 100 days for, particularly for K-8 kids. So I would think it's probably something that's been done, not to worry about it, and life goes on.
Is it too early to push for compensatory services with some students still in remote learning and some in back to in-person?
So I think as we're wrapping this up, that's probably a great question to end on. It is never too early to look at compensatory services when you have a thoughtful discussion about, has the student received the services that were identified on the IEP? And this is even, as I mentioned during the presentation, this is something that was going on prior to the pandemic. And I think the pandemic has only exacerbated the intensity of having those discussions. You've got to look at your IEPs. You've got to look at, to answer the very important question, which is, has the student been receiving the services which are identified on the student's IEP? And if the answer to that is yes, you're fine. If the answer to that is no, then you've got to look at compensatory services, which is why I mentioned at the outset some meetings that Emily and I had with a very large urban district where they were saying they had $250,000 in need of compensatory services. And this was way before the pandemic. So I think that folks on the call will be best served if they are trying to answer that question and then determining if compensatory services are needed to address the fact that there's a disconnect, there's a delta, a difference between what's articulated in the IEP and what the kid is actually receiving. So I think with that, I think we're at the magic time that you told me we had. So I will let you wrap it up.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Pasternack. It's been an honor to have you with us today, and to Emily for kicking us off this afternoon, and for all of you for joining us. We're super excited to have you with us, and we hope you got some useful information today.
To echo, thank you, Dr. Pasternack. Thank you, everyone. We will be disseminating information. Also, follow us on LinkedIn. We put out a lot of information on there as well. And if we can better support the questions that you posed today, that's where you can find that information or a link there.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
See you.